Joe, here's my question. Can you share your approach to working with tribal communities on broadband projects? And the other part of this question is, what are some key factors that need to be considered when planning for network deployment in these communities?
Oh, how long do we have?
You can have Bryan's time.
Yeah. Well, I think he already forfeited it anyway. He was late. But thank you for the question. That's a key question. It's also the starting point, of course. You know, the generally, and most of the time specifically, the starting point is to assess the needs. Because it's oftentimes thought, we'll just build it and it'll work. And that's not usually the case. And what I mean by that is, you know, a network works, you know, you pull fiber, you do whatever you do, and people get connected. But for the community to have a plan that has priorities, how you roll out, when you roll out, what the costs are, sometimes expectations of what that connectivity is going to bring to the community need to be measured, need to be understood, so that the sometimes unrealistic expectations of like launching a rocket to the moon is not going to happen just because you have fiber. But you have basic connections, what the cost is going to be for the end user. A lot of planning, a lot of talk has to go in, and it's particularly important that the politicians in the community play a big role in that, so they understand how the political priorities of the council or whoever it happens to be, the consortium, are being met or not, and why that's the case and what the trade-offs are. You know, sort of the political argument or the political point of view. That's very, very important. So assessing the needs in an in-depth way, sitting down, having real tough conversations sometimes with the political leadership and oftentimes the community, so that expectations are set right, is probably the most important thing of all, Gerad.
Thank you for that, Joe. Another part to this question I wanted to ask is, what are the unique challenges that tribes face when it comes to owning and operating their own broadband networks? Well,
again, that's a pretty broad question, but generally it's the lack of expertise, the lack of specific knowledge about, you know, how the network runs, what it takes to keep it maintained, operating, billing, you know, how to run the business of a network. That's generally lacking, and it's something that is that takes some specific knowledge to understand again too. So tribes may not realize that, or villages may not realize that, but that's an important conversation. An important part of the planning from day one is, how are we going to operate this? As some of you heard me say over lunch, we want the tribes to own the infrastructure and own the operations. That means you have to operate. And either you bring someone in to do that, or you do a hybrid where whoever you bring in to do that is training people in the community to take over. That's what we like to see happen. But it's very specific knowledge, software support, hardware support, a lot of things go into that. So, and not many places and not many native places in the U.S. have that expertise. In fact, very few. There's maybe a handful and a half that actually are operating their own network of some kind, you know, with more or less success, you know, because it's hard to do. So that's my broad answer to the question.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Next question is going to go to Mr. Proctor. And the question is, so the USDA has played a significant role in funding broadband infrastructure. Can you walk us through how federal funds are being used to build networks in Alaska and what key outcomes are being prioritized?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the state director earlier today, State Director Nelika, and LaKenya and so many other folks did a great job of highlighting the USDA investments that are being made in Alaska. So I don't need to rehash that. Almost $500 million have gone into Alaska since fiscal year 2021 to support network deployment. And a little bit that was touched on earlier is that we've made a lot of changes to our program, at least the Reconnect program over the last 2 years, to make sure that funds are being focused in places like Alaska. We talked about the matching requirement being waived. I heard earlier today that the matching requirement is a huge barrier for communities that want to access our programs. So for tribal governments and Alaska Native corporations, we did waive that matching requirement if the project is serving those tribal areas. We also decided to make grant awards up to $35 million. This is a level we have never made under the Reconnect program. Typically, we cap the maximum award amount at $25 million, but we know that it's incredibly expensive to serve remote areas in Alaska, so we upped that threshold to $35 million. I heard a lot that despite all these changes we're making to the program to make it easier to get funds into Alaska, it's still a really difficult process to access not just the Reconnect program, but federal funds in general. And so that's why we established the Broadband Technical Assistance Program 2 years ago, because capacity is an issue. And we heard that particularly for tribes and local governments, it's really challenging to plan a broadband network, get funding, successfully manage that funding, meet the reporting requirements, own and operate the network, and close out your project. And so the goal of the Broadband Technical Assistance Program is to meet communities where they are. And I mentioned during the last session that Becky kind of gave our program a shout out, is that it doesn't matter to us if you need a feasibility study or to hire a broadband program manager or broadband staff. We want to support you no matter where you are in your journey, and there's no requirement that you pursue USDA funds after working with us. You can go after state funds or FCC funds or NTIA funds. We just want to work with communities in the way that works best for them. And to your question on which outcomes are we prioritizing, we are just looking at improving opportunity and quality of life in rural and tribal communities. And so we know that broadband opens up so many opportunities, whether it's distance learning and telemedicine, remote work, whether it is smart agriculture. Our goal is to make sure that rural residents have opportunity that they otherwise wouldn't have if they didn't have broadband.
The other part to this question is, how do you not only ensure that these projects get built, but how does the USDA go about ensuring that they're sustainable for the long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we talk a lot about future-proof networks. And so there are really two things I want to highlight here. The first is that we do have a rigorous review process. That has its pros and its cons. Its cons are that it makes the program a little more difficult to apply to. But the benefit here is that we are making awards to organizations that we are confident will deploy a high-speed internet network that is reliable over the course of the composite economic life. We don't want to make awards for a 30-year project and the organization won't be around in 30 years. And so, we do our due diligence in looking at financial projections and that type of information to make sure that we are providing funds to the highest quality company or companies that can provide the level of service that they're promising. The second is our build-out requirements. We kind of tweak them every year, but in the most recent funding rounds of the Reconnect program, we require 100 meg symmetrical build-out. And so again, this ties back to having that future-proof network. We ask that a professional engineer certify it because we want to be confident that the networks we're financing are not just a good use of taxpayer dollars, but to your point, are going to be sustainable over the long term.
Thank you for that. Next question is going to be for Bryan with Quill Solutions. So Bryan, you essentially install networks in some of the most hostile and challenging environments in the world. In places you do that in rural Alaska. Can you explain what some of the logistical and technical challenges are when you do these build-outs in these remote communities?
Sure. So I think going back to one of the earlier speakers, a lot of it is planning. A lot of it goes into planning all the nuts, planning all the bolts, planning the airplanes, planning boats, planning logistics on how things go out the door, and pre-testing. So before it goes out the door, that it works, that it functions the way that it is supposed to. So a lot of that pre-deployment work is what defines success of a deployment, because there's no hardware story. Can't you forget a bolt, or they sent you metric and all of your bolts are standard, right? It's like those are all pieces that kind of go into it, and weather, obviously, logistics. But planning prior and testing, bench testing before, and so when it does go out the door, then when we light it up, it works.
So can you tell me, Bryan, what new technologies are on the horizon that will make building networks in rural Alaska easier?
I don't know if there's necessarily a technology that is going to do that. It's really going to be teams. It's really going to be the teams of people that are doing deployments, and the engineers behind, the guys driving boats, flying airplanes, climbing towers. That team of people is really what's going to make deployments smoother. I think just personal observation, as funding becomes available or actually starts hitting the street, we're going to see more and more lower 48 contractors come to Alaska for particular pieces of deployment, and pardon the French, it's probably going to be a shit show, right? Because they don't know how to get out who the barge company is and who is doing what, or how to work with communities. They're coming from Alabama, right? They just don't know. So I think there's going to be a lot of, as that workforce development kind of gets crunched, being able to look at in-state teams that have done it, are doing it, and kind of show the past prior performance that they're doing, they say.
Thanks, Bryan. The next question is Christian, General Counsel again. I think I mentioned that earlier with Windtalker Innovations. So Christian, Windtalker Innovations provides cutting-edge wireless technologies. Can you explain how your solutions are helping improve broadband access and capacity in Alaska's most underserved regions?
Well, I would start by saying I don't think we are making the dent that we intend to yet. So the premise of the question, I think, gives us maybe more credit than we've earned, but it's certainly...
Okay, aspirationally speaking.
Aspiration, thank you. Okay, aspirationally speaking. I think Windtalker is trying to do the same thing that everybody's trying to do, which is to get to the end state, right? To get to this quality of life improvement, to get to this sort of opportunity enhancement scenario where people can actually take advantage of the resources that everyone else take for granted. So one of the ways that I think Windtalker is trying to help us get there is by using what I think of as more flexible, more nimble, and honestly a little bit more experimental tools, software, firmware, and cloud-based SaaS platforms to bridge the capability gap that currently exists in existing hardware. Even as amazing products are coming out of these factories and OEMs are coming up with like the latest and greatest thing, the reality that people are living with in the villages right now are that those existing hardware technology offerings don't do the job, right? For a huge variety of reasons. And we're not going to solve all those reasons, but one of the things I think we've realized is that hardware can be more than it was made to be. Using software, using firmware, and integrating cloud management platforms allows hardware that was designed to do one thing to serve a completely different function and offer a completely different capability set, building on what already exists, but adding the thing that the hardware doesn't yet provide. And we can do that in a way that doesn't require the same sort of commitment to a hardware manufacturing line than that would be required if you were to bake these solutions into the hardware itself. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is experimenting into the gaps. The second thing that we're trying to do as a company is not solve all the problems, but support the people who are solving the problems. So one of our strong values as a company is we want to partner, we want to enable, we want to accelerate, and we want to try to fertilize other people's efforts, because I think that, you know, we've seen over and over that the community of mind is the most powerful mind. And so we just want to contribute a little bit to that. And then I think the third thing that Windtalker is doing, Joe mentioned it, Bryan mentioned it, We're trying to use our powerful suite of software solutions, which runs on different, variety of different kinds of hardware. But we're trying to use our software to make things easier, to reduce that knowledge barrier to managing and running a network, and to reduce the kind of just workforce surge that is required to stand up and then manage a network. Just making it easier. Fewer truck rolls, fewer poles climbed, and fewer problems where you got to call in a specialist and have them come in and run diagnostics to fix things. We think that the user should be able to fix their own networks. Whether you are the network operator or you are the network consumer, what we're trying to get to is a zero-touch internet reality for everybody. And Windtalker, I think, has a set of solutions that are helping bring that about. And we're looking for folks who have cool stuff that we can integrate with and cool ideas that we can collaborate with to advance and, I think, as I say, accelerate that effort.
I guess is a really good point on the use of technology for quicker deployments or easier, more streamlined deployments is picking the right technology, right? Things that work together, things that test together, that's a whole process in itself. And so that engineering component is an important, it doesn't take an engineer to do power cycling or go in and do a simple configuration, right? That can be taught. So picking and using technologies that enable that. Because there's some out there that, man, sales pitch sounds great. You look under the hood, you're like, oh my gosh, Windows 95, really? Like, it's just, so picking the right technologies and certainly help on that deployment side.
Thanks for adding to that, Bryan. Christian, another question for you, and that is, what role do the legal and regulatory frameworks play in planning and deploying broadband networks in Alaska, and how can they be streamlined to accelerate projects if they can?
So I am also looking for answers to those questions. I think one of so many people have said this, but one of the things that I think I run into in my little stream of work, but also we run into it as a company, is I think the cultural and then also commercial impediments that arise out of this fiber-first mentality. And fiber is beautiful if you can get it, but if you can't, we got to think about something else. And I think that whether you're looking at funding or grant regimes, or whether you're looking at quality of service metrics, I feel like we're still measuring ourselves against a fiber standard that doesn't reflect the reality that people are actually going to be living with when the internet comes home. It's not all going to be fiber-based. The other thing, and I believe you mentioned grant compliance, working with a lot of different communities in a lot of different settings, not all of it broadband-based, but when you are dealing with government-based grants, the ability to comply with the back-end obligations is so onerous and so easily underestimated or discounted on the front end that I feel like there are a lot of communities and organizations that have tried that, were not properly set up to succeed, got severely burned, and now don't want to do it again. So there's a major deterrent effect to some of the compliance mechanisms, which I think are coming from the right place. But the more we can modulate and moderate those to meet people where they are and have them provide the assurances in a way that's attainable for them, I think would be a major improvement in the incentive structure that currently exists.
Thank you for that, Christian. All right, this question is going to be to all panelists. If you have anything to add, I'm going to start with Joe, please. And the question is, what are the most critical factors that need to be addressed in the planning phase to ensure long-term success of broadband networks in rural Alaska?
I'm not sure there's just one. I think if you don't consider the entire project from day one to provisioning your first customer, you're making a mistake. I mean, you're going to make mistakes along the way anyway, but if you haven't planned as much as you can for the contingencies along the way, you're setting yourself up to fail. So I don't think there's any one thing. I mean, that's kind of a broad answer, but I can't identify just one. I think the one that Christian just talked about is the least obvious one that causes a failure, even if the network is built out and operating, and that's failure to comply with the terms of the grant, because that brings, I was going to use the word grief. It brings grief to everybody that's involved that was part of the grant writing, grant process at the grant recipient level, and it can bring terrible grief if not that things have to be done that were illegal, but the way the government accounting office or the inspector general or whomever is doing the compliance review, has a reason to suspect that you didn't account for the penny the way you should have accounted for it. The first assumption isn't that, oh, you made a mistake. It's that, oh, somebody took that penny. That's more times than not, 99% of the time, the wrong assumption to make. But it's the worst assumption, and it's the one that then you have to prove a negative if you're the grant recipient. So I would say you got to plan everything, but from day one, compliance needs to be part of the process at every step along the way to avoid that. And it also makes for a better project, frankly. So that's my start, Gerad.
Okay. Mr. Proctor, could you add to that anything?
Yeah, it's hard to choose just one factor, but I think community engagement from start to finish is so important, and we heard that actually during the last session as well. Your network should truly be designed around the community that you're serving, and you need to meet with community members, meet with all different type of stakeholders to understand what type of network makes sense for them, what their internet needs are, and you have not just your traditional stakeholders, but your non-traditional stakeholders as well. I was in Florida a few months ago meeting with internet service providers, and they told me Thursday night was the night they experienced the highest bandwidth. And does anyone know why that could possibly be?
You're saying they say that consistently?
Yeah, they have been seeing Thursday night as the night they have the highest bandwidth. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You can't watch football on your television anymore on Thursday nights. You have to stream it, and so those are things you don't take into consideration unless you're talking to the entire community to understand how they're going to use the broadband network once it's deployed to them. And so I think that just kind of drives home the point of engage the community from start to finish, understand how they're going to use the internet, make sure that they know how to use the internet once it's deployed to them. And a lot of people, they don't know what they don't know. And so, you can use the internet to work remotely or to order your groceries or, to just do so many things. And if folks aren't trained and taught how to do those different things, then they're missing out on opportunities to make their lives a lot easier.
Thank you for that. Christian, you have anything you might add to that?
I agree with everything that has been said, and I was going to say something very similar, so I won't take time to repeat it. But I think the idea is that we can't just build the bridge to the internet. We've got to make sure that people have the tools and resources to take advantage of it once it arrives. And I think those tools and resources have to be shaped in ways that fit people's hands. Honestly, the thing that gets me most excited about broadband development is all the educational and economic opportunity development programs that come along with it, right? Because I think the internet just as a pipe is relatively useless, but that pipe of connection, that conduit of connection, together with a set of culturally and community sensitive tools and kind of like a toolbox or a resource inventory, makes it transformative. So I think sustainability is making sure that bringing the internet to the community matters in 10 years because people have been able to use it to change their lives and their families' lives. That to me is the key. Otherwise, we'll just pull up the money and go spend it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think with that, there's kind of multiple trajectories as far as building networks, right? You can be completely independent and apply for money and go build it and build a ISP, right? Build a telecom or a WISP. And you can also partner with existing carriers, right? Existing service providers. And that's also an option, and communities should entertain that option, right? And the sustainability component, there's a portion on the community side that you need to know what's in the grant that was applied for on your behalf. You need to know what those metrics are so you can hold carriers or partners, whoever they may be, accountable, right? Because a lot of times deployments happen and a network becomes unsustainable because communication-wise it was never communicated what they're actually getting. And I've mentioned this a few times, there are communities out there that signed up for grants that were a lot of money, but those grants never actually made or never intended or will intend to connect those houses, right? I don't think that that was ever communicated to the communities, because, so read the grant, read the communications, make sure that the partners that you're partnering with actually do have the benefit of the community in mind. Because there's a lot of money out there and there's a lot of money flowing. It's important that communities make the best decisions to keep those networks sustainable, right? Because there's a certain amount of subsidy that's needed. There's to keep sustainable, keep jobs, right? Communities need to know what they're being delivered on. And I kind of harp on this on, we talk about 100 by 100, 100 by 20, but the elephant in the room is oversubscription, right? If oversubscription, you get 100 by 100, but the carrier's overselling 100 to 1, you really don't get anything close to 100 by 100, right? You're only getting 1, 2 when everybody gets online. But it's kind of, everybody talks about latency, jitter, but oversubscription is probably the largest impact to networks. Just try to get on the internet at 5 o'clock in Anchorage. That gig service is too much of a gig.
I was going to bring that up. I think one of the areas that's not very well talked about at all during the planning process is capacity. You know, we all talk about speed, 100 up, 100 down, 100 symmetrical, 50 up, whatever the number happens to be that we consider to be speedy internet. But, look at it this way. If the pipe is this big, that's all that you can fit in the pipe. If the pipe is that big you can fit more, but it depends on the time of day. Thursday night, I guess, makes a difference. That's about the capacity of the network. That's part of the planning process. That's what Bryan was just talking about. And that's, the more I do this, the more I'm not so worried about the speeds as I am about capacity. Because once you get the internet, your refrigerator talks to it, your oven talks to it, your kid, every toy that the kids have talks to it, the 23 things in your office you didn't realize talk to it. It's all capacity slowing down. Just at the time you need this crucial information to come onto your computer, everything in the house is connected to it and you can't access it. So when you're planning, to the extent you can, plan for capacity. You hear so many operators that we're providing capacity to the village, and we're giving them 2 pair. Yeah. That means you're going to run out of capacity on every Thursday night. So just anyway, I think that's a big point about planning too. So.
Christian, a comment you made a minute ago about the internet being relatively useless. I said that back in 1994, so shows what I know. You were right back then. Right. Joe, I'm going to ask you this question. You have clients in Alaska, tribal clients, and you have clients out of state, in Indian country in the lower 48 states. Bryan was just talking about, he was talking about the challenges. You got to inventory before you go, because if you forgot this or didn't get that and you need it, you got a problem on your hand because you're not going to be able to get it where you're at. So that notwithstanding, as a very obvious challenge in contrast to the lower 48 states, when working those communities, what other distinctions would you draw with Alaska Native communities versus reservations and working with tribes in the states?
Not very many, as a matter of fact. I guess remoteness is a question of degree sometimes, but if you're remote, which means here you could be several hundred miles away from something, but if you're in, where I'm from, South Dakota, you can still be 200 miles away from the nearest hardware store if you need to buy a bolt or your wrench breaks or something like that. So, a question of degree when it comes to remoteness is just relative. It's still remote regardless. I think that I guess the primary difference, not in every instance, is that there are more people surrounding native lands in the lower 48, more communities of different kinds. So there's more opportunity in many ways, and some challenges because politically those communities don't always get along. That's probably the nicest way to say that. So that might be the other big difference, is that there's more opportunity with more political challenges that surround it. But I know the point wasn't necessarily remoteness, but when you think about Alaska, as I said at lunch, we have to put that aside. That's a given. Native development's going to be remote, and that's a factor, but it's not a reason not to do it. So that's what I can think of, Gerad. I think that remoteness is relative. It's still remote, and there's just more people in the lower 48 generally. So.
Thank you for that, Joe. So I'm going to ask the audience if they have any questions for the panel. No questions. Man, you guys did such a good job. Well, we still got time. So, Chris, what would be a good question for me to ask you that I didn't?
Well, you've had some pretty good questions so far. I think I would just highlight the fact that USDA is just one piece of the puzzle, and Becky highlighted a really great resource on one of her slides during her last presentation, which is the Broadband USDA website. And there's a really cool tool there that allows you to select your entity type, whether you're a tribe or a nonprofit or an internet service provider. You answer questions on what your needs are. Do you have planning needs? Are you ready to deploy a network? Do you need help with environmental? And as you answer those questions, the tool spits out a list of funding opportunities for you. And so I just raise that because it's not a tool that many people know about. And again, USDA is just one piece of the puzzle. We work closely with Commerce and FCC and dozens of other federal agencies that have great opportunities. So come talk to me. I'll be at the networking event later. I'll be around the rest of the day and would love to talk about some of those opportunities that I know about. I don't know all of them, but there's more than just USDA in this space.
And I would strongly encourage everybody to take advantage of his offer at the reception this evening that Tribal Ready is sponsoring, food and drinks, 49th state. Please be there, and please talk his ear off and get all the information you can get from him, and let him share that with you, because he's here to be accessible, and the whole point of this conference is both information, but also connecting the resources to the demand and the needs. So if you're here representing your village in any capacity, I really encourage you to speak with Chris. Christian, what would be a question that I should have asked you that I didn't? How tall are you? I look up to you.
6'6". I think you could have said to me, hey, Christian, this osmosis stuff sounds amazing. How can I get that into my network? Or how can I
was trying to do that through osmosis.
Where can I find? No. We are, as a company, we are moving our product towards market. What I would love to be asked is, how can you, I want someone to come up to me and say, here's how we're living. What can you guys do to improve our chances of getting connectivity into our community? And I just want to take that problem back to the lab and back to the people who think deeply about this stuff and come up with a solution. So later at the reception, if you have a novel problem and other people have told you we can't bring internet to you, will you tell me about that, please? That's the question I want.
Thank you, Christian. Appreciate it. Again, go and talk to him at the reception that Tribal Ready's paying for. So, Bryan, what could I ask you that I didn't but I should have?
I think probably the question is, from a community perspective, if my community is already served, then what now, right? And I think Becky did an exceptional job about having these conversations with folks like myself or Christian and Joe, that you don't necessarily have to think about the problem directly, right? There's a lot of ways to think about a problem, and where you want to go, where you want to get to might not be a straight path, right? That you play the funding sources, but there still is opportunity if you're from a deployment standpoint or like network stand-up standpoint or connectivity standpoint. We just need to think a little bit differently about what that may look like in prioritizing community needs, right? So you may be going with this, but you're looking for this over here. But the funding agency, this is what they want, and we need to do that as far as our obligations go. I guess the second piece of that is, if we are writing grants, how do you not make the reporting requirement a ridiculous burden, right? Is planning on the front end, right? You have to plan the grant, plan the deliverables, plan what those line items look like in order to ease your reporting. If you go in and you're just like, this and that, and it's all over the place, then your reporting is going to be all over the place. So thinking about how to make reporting easier really does start at the beginning in the planning portion of, how do I structure this grant? How do I look at the line items? What am I spending things on in order to balance that? You don't want to be tracking down the $5 receipt for a Snickers bar. Sucks. Had to do it.
You should stop eating Snicker bars then.
Just
that's the problem. Joe, I'm going to leave you with a final comment on building and planning broadband networks. Clearly, you guys answered the questions, or you spoke so well about everything, nobody has questions, so you go ahead and close it out.
I think Brandon has.
Brandon, you got a question?
Sure.
Go for it.
Woo! Sorry, I'll karaoke later. Hey, so I'm curious for anybody on the panel that has an answer for this. It's kind of two parts. One is, what are the top needs that you are seeing are being fulfilled when internet finally reaches an area? And then what are the top bottlenecks to getting internet spread throughout Alaska?
Brian? You stumped him.
Well, I don't know. I think the bottlenecks on getting it to the community obviously is logistical and funding related. Adoption side, I don't think that there will be a problem on the adoption side. I think it will be a problem on the knowledge side. That, I mean, there's a lot of great things in the internet, but the internet is a double-edged sword. You can do a lot of great things, but you can also go down some serious black holes, right? And so the communication with elders, the communication with leadership, kids, and talking about the internet, sitting down with folks, that broadband use and adoption component is really important. On the deployment side, I think communication, logistics are all pieces. But we also need alternative technologies, right? We need to fill gap now while terrestrial connectivity is coming, right? Because business doesn't stop now. Doesn't stop just because I have internet. I just got to find it, right? Whatever that looks like.
I have another answer. It sort of covers all that. The cost. Once it's deployed, how much does it cost, especially in Alaska? You know, I'm not sure that the price that the end user pays makes it as accessible as it should be. In fact, I'm sure it doesn't, as a matter of fact. You know, there's a lot of complex reasons for that, but there's a lot of money that comes to a state like Alaska that's meant to subsidize the end user, that the end user doesn't always see, which is unfortunate. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but there's a lot you could look into for yourself, or you know, we might make some other information available later as it gets verified. But I think that's the biggest thing of all, and it isn't all because the FCC subsidy went away. It's because there are still subsidies that were meant to make sure that the end user had a reasonable cost for reasonable access, and it's not happening. It's not happening yet. We're all up here because that's what we want to have happen. We're committed to making that happen, but it's still hard. But I think that cost thing is the biggest bottleneck and the biggest logistical issue that you have, because sometimes we feel pretty helpless about it. So.
Yes, in the back.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, so we're no, we have, the infrastructure's been built out until you brought it in years ago. But then it sat in town for a year, waiting for the last mile service, a storefront to open up and give out the modems and say, here's your subscription, and this is what it's gonna be. And then, once we got that rolling, the competition in town, who tried to boycott them, ends up coming in buying a greater share of that same subsea fiber. They roll out their plan and squash the other guy, and at the end of the day, it's all about access, right? So in the end, now we have two storefronts that neither one's completely closed, the first one we provided. The second one is barely there, they don't know what we're talking about. And so the infrastructure can't sustain. So the simplest solution is Starlink or something else, you know. So subsea is great, it provides infrastructure, but the people who sucked it up from the beginning were all the federal entities and the corps of the end user, the people who could use the support for the telemed and counseling services and suicide prevention and all that stuff. They can't get access to it, you know. So at some level in our villages, so we're talking about owning it at a village level. What does this mean? Like, if I sign on to subsea fiber, is it one carrier? You know, is it the middle mile person I'm negotiating with, or is it the last mile person that I'm negotiating with? Who am I actually facing off with to defend my region or my village? We advocate for people all down the coast. How do I actually have conversations with these people, and how do we not get into, we actually care about the end user. We don't care, I mean, profit has to happen, you know, money has to happen in this space, but I can't afford it, or I don't have anybody that can serve me when I do get it because of all the riffraff of the companies behind the scenes. They don't have a storefront now, so you can't get support.
Is that a rhetorical question?
It
Well, I mean, I'm just going to ask you to
true.
rephrase it. If you want to answer, just can you package it tighter?
So two things. One is, how do we help our villages understand how to communicate with the entities that we need to have so that it actually gets brought last mile, whether they're starting their own ISP or not, I don't know. I mean, that's a new concept. Even in our community, that's a new concept. But two, the cost of all of that to be brought in, you know, how do you balance that for being able to pay for it and actually have somebody there that will have a storefront that can help the people on the end make it work?
Who wants to take a stab at that? Joe?
Well, I'll say this. I think you've asked a very complicated question, or maybe not the question, but the background to the question is very complicated. How do you fit all the pieces together? A couple of thoughts. One, you know, you heard me earlier today, I think, talk about natives owning the infrastructure and owning the operations. That's a step in the solution if you're in that situation, in that there's nobody better focused to serve the people that are in the community than the community itself, as far as I'm concerned. As far as connecting to subsea fiber or to the backbone of the internet, if the entity that owns the backhaul has received federal dollars to put that backhaul there, they have to deal with you, and they have to deal with you fairly. And if they don't, then you go to guys like Chris and say, hey, they're not dealing fairly with me, come help me. So that's as simple of an answer as I can give you to admittedly a very complicated situation. But you need good advisors, you need people like us on the panel to help you with that, and I think every one of us on the panel want to help you with that.
And I think it brings up a really good point. I had a conversation with a good friend of mine very early in the NTIA process, round one, and we were having just a very heartfelt conversation, and he's like, you know what, he's like struggling with this question. He's like, are tribes really going to be able to do it? He's just finding, he's like, are they going to be able to do it? And I said to him, I was like, hey, you've worked in telecom for a long time. I've worked in telecom a good chunk of time. How many projects do you know on the telecom side that have failed? And he just started laughing. He's like, okay, you're right? Telecom projects done by carriers fail all the time. Example, right? And so the idea that it's tribal and it's going to fail, it really is irrelevant, right? We're looking at community distribution, who's going to be there. And if you don't have anybody there, then it's not going to happen, no matter if a carrier does it or community does it. You need to invest in the champion, the community member, the training to raise the bar. There is lots of training programs, lots of opportunities with partners that can fill that gap and help fill that gap. So I guess to totally roundabout, not answering your question directly, you're in a complicated situation. Thinking differently about what that may mean for the community and discussing potentially hard choices at the community level on what to do, right? Whether or not that's FCC, RCA, USDA, regulatory, suits, just whatever, right? But the conversation needs to happen internally with advisors that you trust, with the community trusts, is an important piece.
Yeah, it sounds like two things. Competition and communication are some challenges you're dealing with, and on the competition front, that's why at USDA we don't want to give funding to company A to build out in your community, and then the FCC give money to company B to then also build out that community, because only one is going to be successful. Two different companies can't serve 75 people and recoup their investment. And so either we're going to have a failed project or our federal partner is going to have a failed project. And so that's why for us, that conversation, that coordination is so important. And whether it's me or your general field representative or the awardee, they should be communicating with you about timelines. So when you say, okay, we're going to give you a resolution so that you can, build out in my community, there should be some awareness that from that point on, that company has to submit their application. There's a review process that can take 12 months, and then that company has up to 5 years to build out that network. So from the time you say, here's a resolution to support this project, it could be 6 years before someone is actually connected. And so that, some would even say that's kind of an aggressive timeline. So that should 100% be communicated to you if it hasn't been. And that's why folks like me are here. That's why you have a general field representative and Natalie to help share important information like that, so folks don't get their expectations up and expect a network to be deployed in 1 or 2 years.
Thank you for that, Chris. Any other questions? Well, with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. Really appreciate you guys coming up here and sharing your expertise.